Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis, where we explore the link between creativity and mental illness.
Always a fascinating topic.
It is, and today we're going deep on syphilis.
Syphilis.
We're using the book Pox to guide our deep dive today.
Great book.
Yeah, and one of the things that really struck me early on in this book is the fact that there was a time when young men bragged about getting syphilis.
It's hard to believe, right? But yeah, they had no idea. It was like a badge of honor, a rite of passage, totally oblivious to the long-term effects.
And those effects, well, they were devastating. Pox goes into detail about how these guys would suffer relapses for years.
For their whole lives, basically.
And the symptoms, they were all over the place. Gout, typhoid, even mimicking things like malaria.
Syphilis was a master of disguise, the great imitator.
Yeah, and so you can imagine how tough it was to diagnose back then.
Oh, absolutely. Especially before modern testing came along. Trying to diagnose someone retrospectively, it's a nightmare.
Yeah, but that's kind of what makes it so fascinating for our purposes, right?
Yeah.
Can we find evidence of syphilis in some of history's greatest minds?
Right. It's a question that's been debated for centuries.
And the names we're dealing with today are pretty huge. Beethoven, Nietzsche, Baudelaire, Van Gogh. We're even going to touch on Hitler.
Yeah, it's a pretty heavy-hitting list.
It is, and it really makes you think. Could some of the most groundbreaking art, music, and philosophy be linked to syphilis?
Well, to understand that, we got to start with syphilis itself, where it came from, how it spread.
Right. The Columbian theory says it came back from the Americas with Columbus's crew.
Right. But Pox also mentions some evidence suggesting it might have been in Europe before Columbus even set sail.
So the origin is still kind of murky.
Yeah, it's a puzzle. But one thing that's for sure is that by the late 1400s, syphilis was a major problem.
The Naples outbreak in 1495 was like the starting pistol for a global epidemic.
Exactly. And this wasn't just any disease. This was a disease shrouded in shame and secrecy.
Right, it was a hidden disease.
Absolutely. And that made diagnosis and treatment that much harder.
Imagine the fear and stigma.
Oh, I can only imagine. A disease that can mimic so many others, with symptoms appearing and disappearing for years. Terrifying.
And those periods of seemingly good health.
Those middle years are crucial. That's where things get really interesting when we talk about the Mad Genius Thesis.
Because they weren't just periods of remission.
Right. They were often marked by agonizing pain, neurological problems, and even some pretty strange behavioral changes.
Like a prelude to the final stage of untreated syphilis, right?
Exactly. Paresis, a form of dementia.
So we're talking about a disease that can basically hide out in your system for years and then come back and attack your brain.
That's the scary reality of syphilis.
It's wild to think about. And this is the period, these middle years before full-blown paresis, that has researchers wondering if maybe, just maybe, there's a link between syphilis and creativity.
Right. Could those years of volatile ups and downs, maybe even changes in brain function, explain those bursts of creative energy, that unconventional thinking?
It's like maybe the disease, as it's doing its damage, somehow accidentally rewires the brain in a way that leads to artistic breakthroughs.
It's a bold idea for sure. And we have to remember, we're not trying to romanticize a horrible disease here.
No, definitely not.
Yeah.
Syphilis has caused so much suffering throughout history.
Absolutely. But we can't just ignore this potential connection to creativity either.
It's complicated, it's sensitive, but it's definitely something worth exploring.
Absolutely.
And speaking of complicated, how did people even try to treat syphilis back then? Pox mentions mercury being a common treatment.
Yeah, for centuries, mercury was considered the go-to treatment.
But the side effects were brutal, right?
Oh, yeah. We're talking excessive salivation, ulcers, tremors.
I read about the rotting teeth.
Oh, yeah. It was bad. A cure that was almost as bad as the disease itself.
Speaks to the desperation surrounding syphilis.
Absolutely. They were so terrified of this disease that they were willing to risk these horrific side effects just for a chance at a cure.
And let's talk about those spirochetes. You know those tiny bacteria that cause syphilis?
Yeah, those corkscrew-shaped things.
Pox really gets into the nitty-gritty of how they work, how they burrow into the tissue, hiding from the body's defenses.
Yeah, it makes sense why it was so hard to treat before penicillin.
And those middle years, the years after the initial infection where the person looks healthy.
But those spirochetes are quietly doing their damage.
Exactly. And Pox talks about all sorts of changes happening in the body and mind during this time.
Oh, yeah. Personality shifts, erratic behavior.
I even read about criminal acts.
It's like the disease is slowly taking over the mind.
Right. And all this makes it clear why syphilis was often misdiagnosed, especially back then.
Of course. Doctors probably saw these symptoms as separate problems, never realizing it was all connected to this one disease.
The tragedy of syphilis is that it was such a master of disguise.
Absolutely. It was a chameleon?
And that's what makes this whole deep dive so fascinating. We're looking for clues. We're looking for patterns.
We're trying to connect the dots and see if we can find syphilis hiding in the shadows of some of history's biggest names.
Right. So let's start with a case where the diagnosis is pretty much a sure thing. Franz Schubert, a musical prodigy.
Schubert. Oh, yeah. Incredible talent. Gone too soon.
And Pox suggests syphilis played a role in his decline.
It really does. His later years were rough.
He was only in his late 20s when his health started to go downhill.
Intense pain. Bursts of energy.
The classic tortured artist.
It's a tragic story. Schubert kept composing masterpieces, but his physical and mental state just kept getting worse. Headaches, dizziness.
Even fits of rage.
Yeah, it wasn't pretty. Pox paints a really grim picture.
And while his official cause of death was listed as nervous fever.
Many medical historians believe it was actually complications from syphilis. He was only 31.
Another reminder of how insidious this disease was, how much potential it robbed from the world.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's move on to another giant of music, Robert Schumann.
Schumann. Now, his case is a little more complicated.
It is. But Pox presents some pretty convincing evidence that points towards syphilis.
There are definitely some interesting clues there.
His later years were really tough. Mental breakdown. Institutionalization.
Really sad. Some biographers say it was just a degenerative mental condition.
But Pox suggests it might have been more than that. They think syphilis might have been a contributing factor.
It's a possibility worth considering.
There's a strange episode in his youth where he hurt himself and was treated with mercury.
Which, as we know, was the main treatment for syphilis back then.
Exactly. And then you have the symptoms leading up to his breakdown. Recurring fevers, extreme fatigue, intense headaches, even paralysis. All signs of late-stage syphilis.
Right. It's like all these seemingly unrelated problems suddenly make sense when you look at them through the lens of syphilis.
Exactly. Even Schumann's doctor's reports, while they don't mention syphilis specifically.
They describe cerebral degeneration, which fits with the kind of damage syphilis can do to the brain.
So we can't say for sure that syphilis caused Schumann's decline.
No.
But it seems pretty likely that it played a major role.
I think that's a fair assessment.
It's another example of how syphilis wasn't just a physical disease.
It was a disease of the mind.
It could unravel your personality, your very essence.
Yeah.
And speaking of unraveling minds, let's move on to Charles Baudelaire.
Baudelaire. Now, his case is a bit different because there's no real debate about whether he had syphilis. He definitely did.
Right. The debate is about how much it influenced his work, because his poetry is, well, it's dark.
It is. It's full of these contrasting images. Beauty and decay, love and death, the sacred and the profane. It's like he's wrestling with the duality of existence.
And I wonder if that wrestling, that tension, is a reflection of his struggle with syphilis.
It's certainly possible. Imagine living with this disease, knowing it's slowly destroying you, and still trying to find beauty in the world. To find meaning in a world that suddenly feels meaningless.
It's like he's staring into the abyss, but instead of turning away.
He's trying to capture it with words.
Exactly. And those themes, the dark side of humanity, the fragility of life, the inevitability of decay, they become even more powerful when you consider his battle with syphilis.
It's like the disease became a lens through which he saw the world.
Right. It shaped his perceptions. It shaped his art.
It's impossible to say for sure how much of an influence it had. But given its constant presence in his life, well, it's hard to imagine it didn't have an effect.
Okay, let's switch gears now and talk about a painter. Vincent van Gogh.
Van Gogh.
His life and work were both incredibly vibrant and turbulent.
Kind of like syphilis itself.
Right. And unlike Schubert or Baudelaire, there's no definitive proof that Van Gogh actually had syphilis.
Right. It's still a bit of a mystery.
But Pox lays out a pretty convincing case for why it might have been a factor.
It does. They make some interesting points.
So let's dive into the clues. What makes Pox think syphilis might be at play here?
Well, there are Van Gogh's own descriptions of his health in his letters to his brother Theo.
He was constantly battling some kind of illness, wasn't he?
It seems like it. He always had something going on. Fevers, fatigue, intense pain.
And Pox points out that a lot of those symptoms align with the different stages of syphilis.
They do. Especially in the early 1880s, he talks about having severe fever, headaches, even stomach cramps.
And vision problems too, right?
Right. He describes something that sounds a lot like uveitis.
Which is an inflammation of the eye.
Yeah. And it can be a symptom of syphilis.
So those could be early signs of the disease. But what about those later stages, the neurological and psychological stuff?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. In his later letters, he starts talking about feeling like he's charged with electricity.
And he mentions these intense emotional highs and lows.
He even talks about fearing that he's going mad.
That sounds a lot like those warning signs of paresis we talked about earlier.
It does, doesn't it?
And these changes happen right around the time Van Gogh enters his most productive, his most brilliant period as an artist.
Right. He's working constantly, driven by this seemingly endless energy.
It's like the disease, as it's tearing him apart, somehow unlocks this torrent of creative energy.
Which he channels into his art.
Exactly. But of course, it eventually becomes too much for him to handle.
And that leads to his breakdown.
And ultimately, his tragic suicide.
It's a possible interpretation.
Of course, we're speculating here.
We can't go back in time and diagnose Van Gogh. But the parallels between his symptoms and the progression of syphilis,
They're pretty hard to ignore.
they are. And let's not forget about Van Gogh's personal life.
His relationships with prostitutes, his poverty.
These were all risk factors for syphilis back then.
So while we can't say for sure that he had it, it's definitely a question worth asking.
Absolutely. Pox does a good job of raising that question. Could syphilis have played a role in shaping Van Gogh's artistic genius?
It adds another layer to his story, another layer of complexity.
It reminds us that sometimes brilliance and suffering are intertwined in ways we may never fully understand.
We've talked about Schubert, we've talked about Schumann, Baudelaire, Van Gogh. But there's one more name on our list that always seems to generate a lot of discussion.
Nietzsche.
Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher who really challenged the way people thought.
His ideas have had a huge impact on so many people. Thinkers, artists, even revolutionaries.
But his descent into madness has always been this source of speculation and debate.
And syphilis often ends up being right at the center of that debate.
Like with Van Gogh, there's no definitive proof that Nietzsche had syphilis.
Right. It's all circumstantial.
But Pox presents a lot of evidence that points in that direction. They think it might be the explanation for his deteriorating mental state.
It's definitely a sensitive topic. We're not trying to diagnose Nietzsche from beyond the grave. We're
Right.
just trying to explore the possibility that this disease might have played a role in his life and work. So where does Pox start with this one?
Well, the timeline is interesting. Nietzsche's breakdown starts in the early 1880s, right around the time those later stages of syphilis typically show up.
Okay, so the timing is suspicious.
Yeah.
But were his symptoms consistent with what we know about syphilis?
They were. Severe headaches, dizziness, vision problems.
Even episodes of paralysis.
And these weren't minor things. They were debilitating. They changed his life.
And we can't forget about the psychological and behavioral changes.
He became erratic, prone to outbursts,
He showed signs of grandiosity,
delusional thinking.
which again sounds a lot like paresis.
It does. And while some historians argue that his symptoms could have been caused by something else,
Pox makes a pretty strong argument for syphilis being the culprit.
they also point out that he received treatment with mercury and potassium iodide, both common syphilis remedies back then.
Right. Of course, those treatments could have been for other things, too.
Sure. But it adds another piece to the puzzle.
It does.
So, no smoking gun.
No.
But the evidence is pretty compelling. But why is this case so controversial? Why all the debate?
Well, a lot of it has to do with Nietzsche's sister, Elizabeth.
Ah, Elizabeth. She was a major figure in his life
She was his caretaker.
and the editor of his work after his death.
Exactly. And she was fiercely protective of his legacy. When people started suggesting that syphilis was to blame for his madness, she denied it vehemently.
I can understand why.
There.
She saw it as an attack on her brother,
No.
a way to dismiss his brilliant ideas as the ramblings of a sick man.
Right. She pushed other explanations. A hereditary nervous condition, bad reactions to medication, anything but syphilis.
But Pox makes a pretty good case that the syphilis theory, as uncomfortable as it might be, shouldn't be ignored.
I agree. A lot of medical historians now believe it's the most likely explanation for Nietzsche's decline.
It's another reminder that even the greatest minds are vulnerable to disease.
They are. And it forces us to think about the relationship between genius, madness.
And the very nature of what it means to be human.
Exactly.
Okay, we've looked at some cases where syphilis seems like the most likely culprit. But what about those cases that are more uncertain, more mysterious?
Ah, you're talking about Adolf Hitler.
I am.
Hmm.
This is probably the most controversial and intriguing case of them all. The idea that syphilis might have played a role in shaping the actions of Hitler.
The man who started World War II.
It's a question that's been floating around for decades.
It has.
And before we go any further, let's be clear. We're not saying that syphilis caused the Holocaust.
No, absolutely not. The Holocaust was a horrific event with complex historical roots. Reducing it to a single cause would be irresponsible.
Exactly. But we can still explore the possibility that syphilis might have had some impact on Hitler's mental and physical state.
And how that might have affected his decision-making.
Right. So what evidence does Pox present for the syphilis theory?
Well, like with Nietzsche and Van Gogh, there's no direct proof. But there are some interesting clues and historical accounts that, when you put them all together, create a compelling case.
Okay, so let's start with Hitler's early life. Pox mentions that he spent time in Vienna as a young man.
Vienna in the early 1900s.
Not exactly the most wholesome place.
No, lots of poverty, lots of prostitution.
And lots of syphilis.
Absolutely. So even though there's no proof that he contracted syphilis during this time,
It's definitely possible.
it's a possibility we can't rule out.
And Pox also talks about how Hitler's personal doctor, Theo Morell,
Morel,
he treated Hitler for a bunch of different things over the years,
stomach problems, headaches, insomnia,
which could be signs of all sorts of things.
of course. But they could also be signs of syphilis.
Right. So we've got some suspicious symptoms. But is there anything more concrete? Anything that directly links Hitler to syphilis?
This is where it gets really interesting. Pox brings up this document called the Black Dossier.
The Black Dossier.
Yeah, it was
Now-
supposedly put together by Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS.
Himmler. Talk about a chilling figure.
Right. One of the most powerful and ruthless figures in the Nazi regime. And this dossier supposedly had information about Hitler's medical history, including his treatment for syphilis.
Wow. That's huge. But I know the authenticity of the Black Dossier has been questioned over the years. Does Pox consider it to be reliable?
They do. And according to the dossier, Hitler was treated for syphilis in the early 1930s by a very well-known syphilologist.
If that's true, why keep it a secret?
Can you imagine the scandal? The leader of the Nazi Party preaching about racial purity and the superiority of the Aryan race.
And he has syphilis.
Exactly. It would have been devastating to his image and to his whole propaganda machine. Himmler, who was obsessed with secrecy, would have done anything to cover it up.
It makes sense.
It does.
Pox also mentions that Hitler himself seemed to have this weird relationship with syphilis.
Oh, yeah. He was both fascinated by it and repulsed by it.
In Mein Kampf, he even spends several pages talking about it.
Right. He calls it a blood poison that's threatening the health of the nation.
It's almost like he's projecting his own fear of the disease onto the entire German population.
It's possible. His obsession with racial purity, his persecution of the Jews.
Could they be manifestations of his anxiety about disease?
Maybe. It's something to think about.
So again, we can't say for sure whether Hitler had syphilis.
No.
But Pox raises a question that's hard to ignore.
Could this disease, with all its physical and psychological effects, have played a role in shaping the course of history?
It's a chilling thought.
It is, and it really shows us just how profound the impact of disease can be.
We've covered a lot of ground today. The history of syphilis, its potential impact on some of history's most famous and infamous people. And we've seen how this disease, with all its deception and devastation,
It gives us a unique perspective on the Mad Genius Thesis.
it does. But before we wrap things up, there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to address.
You're talking about Tuskegee.
The Tuskegee study, a truly dark chapter in medical history, and a stark reminder of how science can be abused.
It's a horrifying example of what happens when scientific curiosity gets mixed up with prejudice.
And it went on for so long.
40 years.
40 years.
From 1932 to 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service studied the progression of untreated syphilis in hundreds of black men in Alabama.
And these men had no idea they were part of a study.
They weren't told they had syphilis,
They weren't given any treatment.
even after penicillin became widely available in the 1940s.
It's hard to believe something like this happened in a country that claims to value freedom and equality.
It really is. And it wasn't some secret backroom operation either. It was a collaboration between the Public Health Service and the Tuskegee Institute, a historically black college.
So this wasn't just a few rogue scientists.
No.
This was a systematic, government-sanctioned study.
Supported by the medical establishment.
And the justifications they used.
Yeah.
They're appalling. They said these men were charity patients who wouldn't seek treatment anyway.
They even went out of their way to prevent these men from getting treatment from other sources.
It's a clear example of the systemic racism that was so deeply ingrained in American society back then.
Absolutely. The Tuskegee study is a stain on the history of medicine.
A total betrayal of trust. And it's had a lasting impact on the relationship between the medical community and communities of color.
It has. It's a story we need to keep telling. We need to remember it so we can prevent something like this from ever happening again.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that ethics have to be at the forefront of scientific research.
Always. The well-being and dignity of the participants should be the top priority.
Always. Okay, as we start to wrap up our discussion of syphilis and the Mad Genius Thesis, what are some key takeaways? What do you hope our listeners walk away with today?
I hope they come away with a deeper understanding of syphilis. It's not just a sexually transmitted infection. It's a complex disease that unfolds in stages with symptoms that can mimic all sorts of other problems.
It can hide out in your body for years.
And then come roaring back, attacking the body and the mind in unpredictable ways.
Like a ticking time bomb.
In a way, yes. And for a long time, people didn't understand syphilis very well, and there was so much stigma associated with it.
Which made diagnosis and treatment even harder.
Absolutely. People were afraid to get help.
Because they were afraid of what people would think.
Exactly.
And that brings us back to the Mad Genius Thesis. What are your final thoughts on this potential connection between syphilis and creativity?
It's a tough question. We know that syphilis, especially in its later stages, can have a profound impact on the brain.
Leading to personality changes, emotional instability.
Even those bursts of energy we've been talking about.
And those changes, while tragic in most cases,
could, hypothetically, create the conditions for creative breakthroughs.
That's the theory. But can we say for sure that syphilis directly caused any of the art or music or philosophy that we've talked about today?
No, we can't. But the connection is intriguing, to say the least. It makes you think about the relationship between biology, psychology,
and the creative process.
Right. And it reminds us that creativity doesn't always come from happy, well-adjusted people.
Sometimes it comes from darkness, from struggle, from suffering.
Exactly.
And maybe that's what makes the Mad Genius Thesis so fascinating. It challenges our assumptions about creativity. It suggests that maybe there's a link between brilliance and our flaws, our vulnerabilities.
The things that make us human.
Exactly.
Our capacity for both great joy and great sorrow.
So what now? What should our listeners do if they're interested in exploring this further?
Well, first, I definitely recommend reading Pox. It's a great starting point for understanding the history of syphilis and its impact on culture.
It's also a great jumping-off point for digging deeper into the lives and works of the people we've talked about today.
Right. Look for those patterns, those clues, those connections that might suggest syphilis played a role.
This is just the beginning. The Mad Genius Thesis is a conversation that's still going on. It's a journey of discovery.
And it challenges us to think critically about the relationship between creativity, mental illness, and the human experience.
So keep your minds open. Keep those questions coming. And never stop exploring.
The mysteries of the human mind are endless. Yeah, a tough time. He was only in his late 20s when things took a turn for the worse.
Yeah, he started experiencing these bouts of pain.
Intense pain, alongside bursts of manic energy.
Sounds familiar, huh?
Yeah.
Like that whole tortured artist thing.
Right, but it wasn't romantic at all. Pox really drives that home. Schubert was still composing, but his physical and mental health.
Deteriorating rapidly.
Yeah, chronic headaches, dizziness, even uncontrollable rage at times.
It's a pretty far cry from that image of the romantic composer just, peacefully composing these beautiful melodies.
Yeah, it really is. And while the official cause of death was nervous fever,
Right.
many historians think it was actually complications from syphilis that killed him at just 31 years old.
Tragic. And another reminder of how syphilis could just rob people and the world of so much potential.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about another musical giant, Robert Schumann.
Schumann, yeah.
His case is a bit more complex, but Pox makes a pretty strong argument that syphilis might have been involved.
It's a heartbreaking story, really.
Yeah, his later years were marked by a pretty severe mental breakdown. He ended up being institutionalized.
Yeah, a lot of his biographers attribute that to just some kind of general degenerative mental condition.
But Pox digs a little deeper and suggests that maybe, just maybe, syphilis played a part.
They lay out some pretty compelling evidence.
Yeah, there's that strange episode from his younger years where he injures himself and then ends up being treated with mercury.
Mercury, of course, being the go-to treatment for syphilis back then.
Exactly. And then you've got all those symptoms leading up to his breakdown. The fevers, the fatigue, the intense headaches.
Even bouts of paralysis?
Which, again, could point to syphilis.
Especially in the later stages.
Right. And it's like all these seemingly unrelated health problems suddenly start to make sense when you view them through that lens of syphilis.
Yeah, suddenly it all clicks into place. And even Schumann's doctor, while he doesn't come right out and say syphilis in his notes, he does describe something called cerebral degeneration, which really aligns with the kind of damage that syphilis can inflict on the brain.
So again, while we can't definitively say that syphilis was the sole cause of Schumann's decline,
No, we can't.
it seems pretty likely that it was a major factor.
I agree. Pox makes a strong case, and I think it serves as yet another reminder that syphilis wasn't just this physical ailment. It had the power to really unravel a person's mind, their whole sense of self.
Absolutely. All right, let's move on to another fascinating figure, Charles Baudelaire.
Baudelaire, the poet.
Famous for his exploration of the darker sides of human nature.
Finding beauty in the grotesque.
Right. And unlike with Schumann, there's not really any debate about whether Baudelaire had syphilis.
No, he definitely did. The question is more about how much that diagnosis influenced his writing.
His poetry is full of these stark contrasts. Beauty and corruption, love and death, the sacred and the profane. It's almost like he's wrestling with these fundamental dualities of existence, good and evil, light and darkness.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to wonder if that struggle, that tension, might reflect his own battle with syphilis. Imagine being diagnosed with this disease, knowing it's slowly consuming you, and still trying to find beauty in the world, to create something meaningful in the face of meaninglessness.
I think Pox does a really good job of putting us in Baudelaire's shoes, helping us understand what he might have been going through. It's like he's staring into the abyss, but instead of turning away.
He's trying to capture its essence in words.
Exactly. He confronts the dark side of humanity head-on, the fragility of life, the inevitability of decay.
Those are all pretty big themes.
They are. And they take on an even deeper meaning when you consider them in the context of his battle with syphilis.
It's like syphilis became a lens through which he viewed the world.
Right. It shaped his perceptions.
Yeah.
And it shaped his art.
It's hard to measure exactly how much influence it had, but it's certainly there.
It's woven into the fabric of his work.
It is.
All right, let's move on to a painter whose life was just as vibrant and just as turbulent as the disease we're talking about. Vincent van Gogh.
Ah, Van Gogh. Such an intriguing figure.
His case is particularly interesting because, unlike with Schubert or Baudelaire, we don't actually have a confirmed syphilis diagnosis.
No, we don't. But Pox makes a pretty compelling case for why syphilis might have been a factor in his life, both his art and his tragic end.
They do. They really dig into the evidence. So let's break down those clues. What leads Pox to believe that syphilis might have been at play?
Well, it starts with Van Gogh's own words, his letters to his brother Theo.
He wrote about his health a lot, didn't he?
He did. He mentioned suffering from all sorts of ailments. Fevers, fatigue, pain.
And it wasn't just the occasional complaint. He seemed to be battling illness constantly.
He was. And while some of those symptoms could definitely have been caused by other things, Pox points out that a lot of them line up pretty neatly with syphilis.
Can you give us some specific examples?
Sure. In the early 1880s, he talks about having this intense fever, headaches, even stomach cramps. And he also mentions having trouble with his vision.
Which could be a sign of uveitis.
Right, which is inflammation of the eye, and that can be caused by syphilis.
So those could be early warning signs. But what about those later stage symptoms? The neurological stuff, the psychological changes, those are the things that really make you think about the Mad Genius Thesis.
Right, and that's where it gets really fascinating. In his later letters, Van Gogh describes feeling this incredible energy.
He talks about feeling like he's charged with electricity.
Exactly. And he describes these intense emotional swings, these highs and lows, and he even expresses a fear of going mad.
That sounds a lot like those warning signs of paresis we discussed earlier.
It really does. And what's even more interesting is that these psychological and emotional changes coincide with Van Gogh's most prolific period as an artist.
This is when he creates some of his most famous works.
Exactly. And Pox suggests that maybe, just maybe, There's a connection. Maybe those bursts of manic energy, that almost superhuman drive to create.
Were fueled by syphilis.
It's a bold claim, but Pox presents some evidence to support it. They point out that Van Gogh was working constantly during this period, driven by this seemingly inexhaustible force. It's like the disease, as it's destroying him, unlocks this flood of creative energy, which he then pours into his art.
But eventually that energy becomes too much for him to handle.
Right. It leads to his breakdown and ultimately to his tragic suicide.
It's a heartbreaking story, but of course we have to remember that this is just one interpretation.
Of course, we can't go back in time and definitively diagnose Van Gogh.
We can't. But the parallels between his symptoms and the typical progression of syphilis,
They're hard to ignore.
they are. And let's not forget about his lifestyle, his relationships with prostitutes, the poverty he lived in.
All risk factors for syphilis back then.
Exactly. So, while we can't say for sure whether Van Gogh had syphilis,
Pox does a good job of raising the question. Could this disease have played a role in shaping Van Gogh's artistic genius?
it's a question worth pondering. It adds another layer of complexity to an already fascinating story.
And it reminds us that brilliance and suffering are often intertwined in ways we may never fully understand.
We've talked about Schubert, we've talked about Schumann, Baudelaire, Van Gogh, but there's one more name on our list that always seems to spark controversy.
Friedrich Nietzsche.
The philosopher who challenged conventional thinking, whose ideas have had a profound impact on generations of thinkers, artists.
Even revolutionaries.
His descent into madness is something that people have been trying to explain for over a century.
Yeah, it's a real mystery. And syphilis often ends up being at the center of that discussion.
Like with Van Gogh, there's no definitive proof that Nietzsche actually had syphilis.
Right. It's all circumstantial evidence.
But Pox presents a pretty compelling case. They believe that syphilis might be the key to understanding his decline. They lay out all the evidence, all the clues, and it's hard not to see the connections. But before we dive into that, I think it's important to acknowledge that this is a sensitive topic.
Absolutely. We're not trying to diagnose Nietzsche from beyond the grave. We're just exploring the possibility that syphilis played a role in his life and work.
Exactly. So what are some of those clues that Pox presents? What makes them think that syphilis might be the answer?
Well, for starters, the timeline is interesting. Nietzsche's mental breakdown began in the early 1880s.
But right around the time when those later stages of syphilis tend to manifest.
Exactly. So the timing is definitely suspicious. But what about his symptoms? Do they align with what we know about syphilis?
They do. He suffered from severe headaches, dizziness, problems with his vision.
He even experienced episodes of paralysis.
And we're not talking about minor inconveniences here. These were serious, debilitating symptoms.
Absolutely. They had a major impact on his life.
And these physical symptoms were accompanied by significant changes in his behavior and personality. He became increasingly erratic, prone to outbursts of anger.
There were even signs of grandiosity.
Delusional thinking.
Again, all of this aligns with the clinical picture of paresis.
Right. And while some historians argue that his symptoms could be attributed to other conditions, Pox makes a pretty strong case for syphilis being the most likely culprit. They also point out that Nietzsche received treatment with mercury and potassium iodide, which were common syphilis remedies at the time.
Right. But again, those treatments could have been for something else entirely.
Of course. We can't know for sure, but it's another piece of the puzzle that fits with the syphilis theory.
It is. It's hard to dismiss.
So while there's no definitive proof, the evidence is pretty compelling. But Nietzsche's case is still surrounded by a lot of debate. Why is that? Why is it so controversial?
Well, a big part of it has to do with his sister, Elizabeth.
Elizabeth Nietzsche.
Yeah.
She was a major figure in his life, wasn't she?
She was. After his breakdown, she became his primary caretaker, and she was fiercely protective of his legacy.
She was also the one who edited and published his work after his death.
Exactly. And when the theory emerged that syphilis might have been responsible for her brother's mental decline, she absolutely denied it.
I can understand why. She saw it as a way to discredit his work, to dismiss his brilliant ideas as the ramblings of a sick man.
Right. It was a threat to everything she had worked to protect. And so she pushed alternative explanations. She suggested that maybe he had inherited a nervous condition or that his symptoms were the result of some kind of medication he was taking. Anything but syphilis.
But Pox makes a pretty convincing argument that the syphilis theory, as uncomfortable as it might be, can't be easily dismissed. It's definitely something worth considering.
I agree. And in fact, many medical historians now believe that syphilis was the most likely cause of Nietzsche's tragic decline.
It's a reminder that even the greatest minds are not immune to the ravages of disease. And it forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about the human condition.
It does. Genius and madness, they're not always so far apart.
All right, we've explored cases where syphilis seems like the most likely explanation. But what about those cases that are more uncertain, more shrouded in mystery?
You're talking about Adolf Hitler.
I am. This is probably the most controversial case of them all. The possibility that syphilis might have played a role in shaping the actions of Hitler, the man who started World War II.
The man whose name has become synonymous with evil.
It's a question that's been debated for decades, and it's one that Pox tackles head-on.
It's a sensitive topic, to say the least.
It is. And before we go any further, I think it's crucial to be clear about something. We are not suggesting that syphilis caused the Holocaust.
No, absolutely not. The Holocaust was a horrific event with complex historical roots. To reduce it to a single cause would be a gross oversimplification.
Exactly. But we can still explore the possibility that syphilis might have had some impact on Hitler's mental and physical state.
And how that might have affected his decision-making.
Right. So what does Pox have to say about this? What evidence do they present to support the syphilis theory?
Well, like with Nietzsche and Van Gogh, there's no definitive proof, no smoking gun.
Right. It's all circumstantial evidence.
Exactly. But there are some intriguing clues, some historical accounts that, when you put them all together, create a pretty compelling picture.
Okay, so let's start with Hitler's early life. Pox mentions that he spent some time in Vienna when he was younger.
Vienna in the early 20th century was, well, it wasn't exactly a beacon of morality.
Right. It was a city known for poverty, prostitution.
And syphilis.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So even though there's no direct evidence that Hitler contracted syphilis during this time, it's definitely a possibility.
A possibility that we can't rule out.
And Pox also points out that Hitler's personal physician, Theo Morell, he treated Hitler for all sorts of ailments over the years. Stomach problems, headaches, insomnia.
All symptoms that could be caused by any number of things.
Right. But they could also be symptoms of syphilis.
They could.
So we've got some suspicious symptoms. But is there anything more concrete? Anything that directly links Hitler to syphilis?
This is where things get really interesting. Pox brings up this document called the Black Dossier.
The Black Dossier.
Yeah. Supposedly, it was compiled by Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS.
Himmler. Talk about a chilling figure in history.
Right. One of the most powerful and ruthless figures in the Nazi regime. And this dossier supposedly contains information about Hitler's medical history, including details about his treatment for syphilis.
Wow. If true, that would be a huge revelation. But I know the authenticity of the Black Dossier has been debated over the years. Does Pox consider it to be a credible source?
They do. And according to the dossier, Hitler was treated for syphilis in the early 1930s by a very prominent syphilologist.
If that's true, why would this information have been kept secret?
Can you imagine the scandal if it had come out that the leader of the Nazi Party, the man who preached about racial purity and the superiority of the Aryan race, was suffering from a stigmatized disease like syphilis?
It would have been devastating to his image, to his entire propaganda machine.
Exactly. And Himmler, who was obsessed with secrecy and control, would have gone to great lengths to suppress this information.
It makes sense. It would have been a huge liability for the Nazi regime.
Absolutely.
Pox also mentions that Hitler himself seemed to have this strange, almost conflicted relationship with syphilis.
Oh, yeah. He seemed to be both fascinated by it and completely repulsed by it.
In Mein Kampf, he even dedicates several pages to discussing syphilis. He calls it a blood poison that's threatening the health of the nation.
Right, and some people have interpreted this as a projection of his own fears.
It's like he's taking his own anxieties about the disease and projecting them onto the entire German population.
It's a fascinating psychological angle.
It is, and it makes you wonder if his obsession with racial purity, his persecution of the Jews,
could all be connected to this deep-seated anxiety about disease and contamination.
So while we can't definitively say whether Hitler had syphilis,
Pox raises a really thought-provoking question. Could this disease, with all its devastating physical and psychological effects, have played a role, however indirect, in shaping the course of history?
it's a chilling thought.
It is. And it really underscores the profound and often unpredictable ways in which disease can impact human affairs.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from the history of syphilis to its potential impact on some of history's most famous and infamous figures.
We've seen how this disease, with its deceptive nature and its devastating effects, offers a unique perspective on the Mad Genius Thesis.
It does. But before we wrap things up, there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to address.
You're talking about the Tuskegee study.
The Tuskegee study, a dark chapter in medical history, and a stark reminder of how science can be abused.
It's a truly horrifying story.
It went on for so long.
40 years.
40 years.
From 1932 to 1972. The U.S. Public Health Service studied the progression of untreated syphilis in hundreds of black men in Macon County, Alabama.
And these men had no idea they were part of a study.
They weren't told they had syphilis.
You weren't given any treatment.
Even after penicillin became readily available in the 1940s.
It's hard to believe that something like this could happen in a country that claims to value freedom and equality.
It is. And it wasn't some clandestine operation in a remote location. It was a collaboration between the Public Health Service and the Tuskegee Institute, a historically black college.
So this wasn't just a few rogue scientists acting in the shadows.
No, it wasn't. This was a systematic, government-sanctioned study endorsed by the medical establishment of the time.
And the justifications they used to rationalize this study are just appalling. They said these men were charity patients who wouldn't seek treatment anyway.
They've even went so far as to prevent these men from receiving treatment from other sources.
It's a stark illustration of the systemic racism and the deep-seated prejudices that permeated American society at the time.
Absolutely. The Tuskegee study is a stain on the history of medicine. It's a betrayal of trust that has had a lasting impact on the relationship between the medical community and communities of color. It's a story that demands to be told and remembered so that we can learn from this horrific mistake and ensure that nothing like it ever happens again.
Absolutely. It's a story that highlights the crucial importance of ethical considerations in scientific research. The well-being and dignity of the participants must always be the top priority.
Always.
Yeah, it really makes you think, doesn't it? How something so small could have such a huge impact on history.
Right. Like this tiny bacterium could shift the course of events. It's fascinating, but also kind of unsettling.
It is. Makes you realize how fragile we are, I guess. How even the greatest minds can be brought down by something like this.
It's true. And it also makes you wonder about how we view these historical figures. Does knowing about this potential syphilis connection change how we see their accomplishments? Does it diminish their genius or just add another layer of complexity to their stories?
It's tough, isn't it? Finding that balance. We don't want to reduce anyone to just their illness, but we also can't ignore the potential impact it had.
Exactly. It's about understanding that interplay between biology, psychology, social factors. It's all connected.
And Pox really emphasizes that syphilis wasn't just a physical ailment. It was this whole social phenomenon, a taboo, something people were terrified of.
Absolutely. And that fear, that stigma, it made everything worse. People were afraid to even ask for help.
Because they were worried about what other people would think.
Exactly. They were afraid of being judged, ostracized.
It's a reminder that disease is never just about the biology. It's about perception, about how society reacts.
Right. It's about the cultural context. And the Tuskegee study, that's a prime example of how those social perceptions can go terribly wrong.
Especially when you add racism and prejudice into the mix.
Yeah, it's a truly dark chapter in medical history. And it reminds us that science can be used for good or for evil.
We have to be careful. We have to be ethical. We can't let something like that happen again.
Absolutely. The well-being of the individual, that should always come first, no matter what.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into syphilis and the Mad Genius Thesis, what are some of the key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I hope they come away with a better understanding of syphilis itself, how complex it is, how many different ways it can manifest. It's not just a simple STI. It's a disease that can impact every aspect of a person's life.
Right, and how that stigma surrounding it made it even harder to deal with. People suffered in silence because they were too afraid to seek help.
Absolutely. And of course, the Mad Genius Thesis itself, well, it's a theory. A starting point for discussion. We can't just say definitively that syphilis caused all these creative outbursts.
But it's an interesting connection to consider. It makes you think about all those factors that can influence creativity. Biology, psychology, maybe even the presence of disease.
Right. It challenges our assumptions about where creativity comes from. It suggests that maybe some of the most brilliant minds in history were shaped, at least in part, by their struggles with this disease.
And we've seen how syphilis might have played a role, even if indirectly, in the lives of all these fascinating people. Schubert, Schumann, Baudelaire, Van Gogh, Nietzsche, even Hitler.
It's been a pretty wild ride, hasn't it? Exploring the connection between disease, creativity, and the human experience.
It has. So to our listeners, keep those minds open. Keep asking questions. Keep digging deeper.
The mysteries of the human mind, well, they're out there waiting to be uncovered.
And that's it for this deep dive into syphilis and the Mad Genius Thesis. We'll see you next time.